Hey, all right, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar on slogans, cliches, and propaganda in education and art. This webinar is actually a follow-up conversation to a webinar we had a few months ago on ideology in American education, race, entitlement, victimhood, and realities of world history. Tonight, we're joined by director, filmmaker Eli Steele and photographer, essayist, it's a tricky word, Ildi Tillmann. We'll be discussing the effects of cultural paradigms, the building blocks and the functioning of slogans and propaganda, and the realities of shared experiences between people in separate racial categories in the North American context. So not just the United States, but North America in general. So a bit about our panelists tonight. Eli Steele, I'm sure you know him. He's on our board of advisors. He is an award-winning filmmaker and a graduate of Claremont McKenna College and Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. His career highlights including producing and directing the film How Jack Became Black, What's Bugging Seth, and What Killed Michael Brown. That film was the winner of 10 film festivals, and he also produced and directed the MTV network pilot Katrina, which won a Breakthrough Filmmakers Award. Ildi Tillmann is a photographer. She's born in Hungary. She's also an author, educator, and a proud mother of two living in New York. She has a master's in African studies from SUNY Stony Brook, and her photography won recognition at several international competitions that were both exhibited in New York and Barcelona. And I should also mention she's a writer for the Journal of Free Black Thought and a member of Fair and Arts, proud member. So with that, we don't have much time. We have an hour. Let's dive in. Ildi, we'll start with you.
Okay.
Now, in your work, you've talked about the fact that propaganda isn't necessarily a creature of the left or the right. It happens on both sides. So can you take a moment to sort of walk us through and describe exactly what propaganda is, how it's structured, and how it works?
Okay, that's a very good question, how it works. So maybe let's go back a little bit to the very basics, right? I mean, maybe a very simple question or simplistic question, answer to this question is that what is propaganda is simply a question of perspective, right? So something that might look like, raising awareness, or I'm just spreading consciousness of something to somebody else who strongly disagrees with those views, of course, it's going to look like propaganda, right? So it's a question of perspective. In that sense, there is a subjective element to that. But I think one of the most important features of how we distinguish information, simple information, from propaganda is what the goal of the information is, right? So especially in photography or documentary filmmaking, today we see a lot of so-called documentaries being put out, which where it very openly have an activist message. So they want to persuade, right? So the goal there is not to simply convey information. It's not to enhance. It's not to make people think. It's not to raise doubts, to ask questions. It's to tell you something. And the goal is to make you believe what they say and then sort of, in a way, influence you to act, right? So they want you to act. So I think that's how I would very simply put, what's the difference between, or where does the line fall? And of course, it's a shifting line, right? Like, where does it fall between, is this information, is this propaganda? That depends on, who's taking in the information. But I would say that the basic thing is, does it want to persuade you to do something? Does it want to make you act in a certain way? Does it want you to take certain steps?
Yeah. And again, so very important. A lot of people now assume that propaganda, particularly in the United States, we assume it's coming from the left because we happen to be living in a time in which just the social landscape has been largely influenced by the left in the past decade. But to make very clear, propaganda can exist anywhere on the spectrum. And when it does appear on the left or the right, are there any salient differences that you notice? Like, is propaganda from the right, does it have a certain flair, a certain texture, whereas on the left, it, you know, takes on other properties, or is it just pretty indistinguishable?
I mean, I'm not an expert in sort of going, you know, like in the deep workings of like how exactly does left-wing propaganda function or a right-wing propaganda. But as far as, you know, like my experience in sort of like 20th century European history, especially Eastern European history goes, the basic building blocks of what is going to create propaganda, that was very similar on the left and the right. And one example is that, like just now that you asked me this question, I don't have the picture here, but if people are going to later on, maybe go to the website of my new project, I will put up a picture. It's two propaganda posters from Hungary, actually from the beginning. I think it was in the like right between, I mean, sorry, before the Second World War and right after the Second World War, right? So, or from the Soviet Union, like if you look at propaganda posters with Stalin or propaganda posters with Hitler, again, the message is the same, right?
Okay.
So the benevolent sort of patriarchal father who comes and takes care of the people, who's going to hug the children. And I was just reading somebody's diary, actually a family member's diary from the time, like, you know, 1944 during the siege of Budapest. And after the siege was over, and so during those times, the kind of posters that you could see on the wall, and after the Soviet occupation, the different posters that you could see on the wall. She was reflecting on that, how it's almost the same. It's just a different face and it comes from a different political side.
Okay. All right. That makes sense.
One,
Oh, yes, Eli, yes.
one thing I've noticed is the propaganda in a way is a way to amass political power in a way. So
Mm,
you use select piece of information that may have some truth to it, and you use that to sort of gain power. So I think, you know, in the 2010s, we have Black Lives Matter. That's a form of propaganda because it's basically saying, hey, you have to be on the side of the good. You must support Black Lives Matter. And we go, okay, of course nobody's against that. But what does that mean exactly? And what was the objective of that? And the most interesting, because you asked about the left and the right, what's interesting is that after October 7th, I think there was a brasherie on the right. And I've been noticing on Twitter X that a lot of people on the right are now saying Christ is king. So it almost has the same, it's a different way of looking at it, but it's almost as if they're saying you get into an argument with somebody and they say Christ is king. And you're like, okay, well, why are you bringing a very religious thing into a political forum? And so for me, it's almost as it's a form of propaganda in a way because it makes you declare allegiance to them or not. Just like you have to declare allegiance, the loyalty to Black Lives Matter or not. Either you're with them or you're not.
interesting. Okay. Um, Ildi, you were talking about propaganda in other countries, and I think it would be a good place for us to start before we come to the United States and sort of giving some historical perspective on how propaganda has functioned in other countries. And just a little side note, my understanding, and maybe I'm not correct here, but wasn't propaganda primarily there's a gentleman named Edward Bernays, who was, I think, the grandson of Sigmund Freud. And he was highly placed in I think, the Woodrow Wilson administration, maybe in the early part of the 20th century. But I've always thought of him as the father of modern propaganda. But clearly, propaganda has been going on for ages before the 20th century. So can you tell us, yeah, like just, I don't know how far back we go, but it would be interesting to see if you know the earliest forms of propaganda and how they've existed in different countries. If there's one country you're more familiar with than others. I think maybe Cuba is a country that you're rather familiar with that. Okay.
Yeah, so we can talk about that. I mean, just to sort of answer your question at the beginning, how far we can go back. Again, I think it really depends what we call propaganda. It depends on the perspective of the person that receives that, right? Like, let's say going back to the Middle Ages, right? Like, was all the theory and the practice of Christianity at that point, like, how much was it a true belief system? How much was it a spiritual system? And how much of that became, in a way, right, a propaganda machine? Like, these are all really complicated questions. So I don't think I want to go back that far historically, because then we're going to get somewhere else. But we can go to Cuba, right? And the means of propaganda in Cuba, and this is why I said, you know, whether it comes from the left or the right, it's going to have very similar strategies. And let me just list a few of them, right? So first of all, it functions on at least two levels, right? So it functions at the visual level, which is mostly the posters, or like now digital billboards, you know, depending on the context, and at the verbal level, right? The written level. So it's with words and visuals at the same time. And the language of propaganda always tries to, when Eli was mentioning, you know, you need to be allies, you need to be, so it in a way, it dehumanizes people. It takes away your individuality, right? So it's going to try to use a language of generalization and labels in order to be able to fit the word into really nice boxes, and then to create a word that, or sort of like a story of the word, the story of reality that fits its purposes, right? So there's always a goal. There's a goal. There's always, again, the question is not, I mean, the goal is not to question, the goal is not to doubt, it's to give you an answer. Here's the problem, here's the solution, and that's what you have to do. So in my mind, this is where propaganda comes in. And it's not only in politics. So, and this is why I started the project that I started, because these types of like textual strategies or visual strategies, they are widespread. So again, so generalization, labels, being simplistic, being authoritative, knowing the solution, right? I know the way forward, so you have to follow me. Documentaries typically, or the kind of films that today go as documentaries, sometimes they say, I don't know, we need to save this and this and this person. We need to, you know, end whatever practice. So it's a very fine line, right? Like whether what goes as information and then what turns into propaganda. Another way to build structures of propaganda is also to use platitudes. And that brings us sort of to the Cuban context. There was a couple of years ago, there was a resistance movement to the current regime. It was the San Isidro movement. And there was a song which became very famous. It was called Patria y Vida. And Patria y Vida, so there's homeland and life, which is sort of a game on, like, because Fidel Castro's original slogan was Patria o Muerte, right? So homeland or death. So we're going to fight till the end. Like, that was the original thought. And then so Patria y Vida is sort of like a play on that, saying, no, we want homeland, but we also want life, right? So we're not going to fight to the death. So in Patria y Vida, there is one line where the singer talks about propaganda, and that's what he says. He says, words that say nothing. And that's one of the things, you know, you just use platitudes, you know, generalizations. Another way to put that, Ben Okri, who's a Nigerian writer, once, I love that phrase. He says, words often used and unnaturally shiny. So that just stuck with me so much. You know, when you hear words that are unnaturally shiny and often used, again, that's going to, so it's not authentic, it's not real, it's not creating questions. Scientific language, in a way, you know, when you use that to humans, bureaucratic language, the DI jargon, all of that academic jargon. So these all discourage, in a way, doubt. They just give you the way forward. I don't know if that answers the question. What was the original question? Like, how do the structures work? And so, yeah, so, but basically these structures, and also that in visuals, right? It's the same thing. Something that's glamorous, you know, something that puts, I mean, now when I walk in New York City, I always look at the big billboards, and, you know, like you have whatever model or actress, you know, like just covering the whole building. And in some ways I'm thinking like, oh my God, like who are the gods that we are putting, you know, like above us in some ways. And so I think all of these things are part of the same structure, the same sort of, yeah, incentive structure.
Okay. I think that's helpful, to have a context outside the United States before we jump into the United States. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about how propaganda manifests itself in our society. I think when most of us think of propaganda in the United States, our minds immediately go to the media because it's rather obvious. Talk about that a lot. But both of you have talked about the fact that we even see propaganda in education and the arts. You've also talked about the fact that propaganda in this country isn't probably as direct and observable, although it's becoming more direct and observable, but not as much as Cuba, for example. So why don't we take a minute to just walk through how propaganda manifests in education first? Which of you want to take that? I don't know who. Ildi? Eli?
Okay.
Go ahead.
I think if you use the word like ethnic studies, that's the perfect example of propaganda, because it's a term where a lot of people are very busy. You know, a lot of us are we're not. We're not going to do a deep dive on things. So we talk about ethnic studies. That's sort of like a blinded thing. Versus here's the moral virtue. We're going to teach our children about the various ethnicities in the United States of America. Sounds like a really good objective, but then what's behind that?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a form of propaganda in a way, because you present a social good. And I think that's what propaganda does in a lot of ways, is it present that image of goodness or something. And so I think you really see that with education, because if you go back to even like Ebonics, we had Ebonics in the remember in the late 1990s. Okay, so Black students are not performing. Okay, well, let's come up with a slogan, Ebonics. Let's say, okay, we're going to make that an official language.
Mm-hmm.
And now we explain why Black students are not performing.
Mm-hmm.
The ways to match the problem is the ways to shame others. If you're not on board with Ebonics, you must be a racist.
Mm-hmm.
Because Black people are different. I mean, that's where the message gets very confusing. I think that's why the Ebonics argument fell apart.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe those are examples of weak propaganda. You know, because they really have enough I don't know, enforcement or truth behind it. But if you think about Black Lives Matter, how much money they made?
Mm-hmm.
They made a lot of money off of that. So,
It kind of makes me wonder if propaganda, I mean, you made a very good point about ethnic studies, but when you think about it, it seems like propaganda has been in education maybe since the very beginning. This whole idea of American exceptionalism, for example, in education, that seems to be a form of propaganda too, or the fact that it didn't happen in my school, but I think in some schools, the role of other cultures, and this comes to ethnic studies, the role of other cultures has really been downplayed. So, I mean, I'm just going to play devil's advocate. I think ethnic studies, even though it is propaganda, it was probably like created in reaction to another form of propaganda about, how strong and great and wonderful the United States is, and I don't know. It seems to me that maybe there are other instances of propaganda that precede ethnic studies. Do you think so, or Ildi? Do you?
Yeah, may I jump in here?
Of course, yes, yes.
Okay, yeah. So I think I would maybe have like a different approach. So the way I saw in education, right? Like it's not, again, propaganda is such a strong word. And I'm sure that a lot of educators and even a lot of the students, they really don't think that what they learn or what they teach is in some ways propaganda, right? And Jonathan Haidt did, like his work on, like just being, so it's not so much propaganda, it's sort of just having one political perspective represented in academia, which sort of ends up creating a situation where there is no real questioning. So most of the people have one perspective, one political perspective, and it sort of becomes natural that's just the way we have to look at things. And for me, who comes from a different culture, right? Like when I started, when I did my master's degree in Africana studies, and what really struck me was sort of what I ended up realizing and what I call the North American paradigm. And the paradigm, just maybe for people who are not familiar with the word, so a paradigm is basically the sphere of allowed thought, right? So it's sort of the cultural context within which we are allowed to think. And again, it's not, allowed is sort of like a strong word, but that's sort of the sphere of accepted thought.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about teaching, right? So the paradigm in North America is that when you, or at least from, my studies, what I saw, when you look at history, when you look at culture, when you look at social conditions or social relations, then the lens that you have to look through, the prism you have to look through, is always going to be race and gender. So, and it's going to be the North American, or the not even North American, it's the experience, the historical experience of the United States. So this is sort of which sets the paradigm. I don't have a better word. It sets the way that people are expected to think about that. So it's a very parochial way because it focuses on the United States. And again, it's very limited because the two lenses, the sort of like the true lenses to understand the world around us, is always going to be put through the lens of race and gender. And then is sort of this kind of understanding and this kind of an analysis of what happens in history and in society, they expand it to the whole world, right? And to me, that in a way, so I wouldn't call this propaganda, but it's a very limited way of looking at the world, right? Which ends up in a way being propaganda because it ends up in a very skewed way of looking at history. It ends up being a very one-sided way of understanding social relations and culture and everything. So in education, yeah, I mean, of course, there are very direct examples of propaganda, especially currently left-wing propaganda in education. But I don't think that's really the overwhelming problem. The overwhelming problem is that people and students, educators, right? They are, or artists especially, right? But I will go to art a little bit later. Educators are not encouraged to think outside of the paradigm. They are not encouraged to look at their own context with the eyes of an outsider, right? And this sort of will result in a situation which you mentioned in the beginning, right? Like the shared stories from around the world, regardless of race. Like race is just sort of, it's the baseline in the United States. You have to understand everything within that context. So the paradigm of the United States creates this situation where this becomes, in my mind, right, like a way of propaganda. Like if you look at the census questions, what do they ask you? If I look at art funders, like what is it that they ask you? There's always this question of like, which race do you belong to? Which, and then of course, I mean, looking at the census question, like this takes us down like a whole different road, which I'm not going to go down at. But like, if you look at the so-called racial categories, in a way, it's a joke because those are not racial categories. Like whoever has like a stronger lobbying group, to be put on the census as a separate racial group, so you can check the box, it will be there. But I mean, I have it here, right here with me. So then Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Filipino, Chinese, these are all separate categories. So in some ways, religious backgrounds, ethnicities, Latino, I mean, the whole idea of Latino as a race, right? So ethnicities are turned into racial categories. So the whole context is fully racialized. And to me, in a way, that's, it will result in a certain way of propaganda. It's the propaganda of racial thinking. Now, again, this is a very strong word. I understand that. But when this sort of inundates thinking and inundates education, that ends up creating this sort of like almost propagandistic or definitely not a balanced way of looking at the world. And just one thing I wanted to say about art, because you were asking how, this is present in art, how propaganda is present in art. And that I feel it's the same thing, like if we look at the granting organizations, grant-making organizations who give the grants, and then whenever they they advertise for a certain theme or topic. If that given theme is going to be a political theme, then artists who create, artists who receive money, artists whose work are going to be visible later on in the public, it is all going to be according to what those organizations thought originally that it was important to give out, right? So the public gets the sense that, oh, these are the things that every artist is thinking about. But that's not true. It's a very skewed picture that people get, that the audience gets, because these are actually the artists who match, right, the granting priorities of these organizations. So who really sets the agenda, or who sets certain artistic interests, is not necessarily going to be the community of artists, but it's going to be the grant makers, right, and the grant makers' priorities. Because whatever they fund, this is what the audience is going to see. So whether this creates, sort of a propagandistic context, I probably could argue it does. I don't
Interesting.
know what Eli thinks about that.
Eli, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you was talking about I was thinking about real estate, and also we was talking about American exceptionalism, or like the American dream. Is that propaganda? I don't think it would be, because each nation has to have its own identity. So he was talking about viewing the world through a North American lens or something like that. I mean, we have to have a cultural identity, a value system, of some sort. So how do you differentiate that from propaganda? And that's why I always think of, maybe I'm wrong here, but I always think of propaganda as something nefarious, as something wrong. Maybe it's because I'm part of my Jewish heritage, but I remember watching those Nazi movies where they would have this man, and I was with this, you know, ill wife who was sick, and basically he would have to come to the realization that it was for the good of the society for him to kill her.
Wow.
And so that was the Nazi film where they were basically endorsing, putting people to death in a humane way. Yeah, so I'm just saying that's sort of, and so it's almost like a propaganda. It's almost like, for me, it's almost in the worst than almost a good match to evil. Some sort of, it allows you to do evil in the name of good. So if you want to do ethnic studies, will allow you to divide people to the oppressed and the oppressor in the name of the good. You want to say, okay, diversity is our strength. Okay, we should racially engineer diversity in the name of the good. And so in the race in America, we have been paying the price for propaganda, whether it came from white supremacy to today's racial era. So it's always done in the name of the good. And one thing that in terms of art, I think the most in my lifetime, the most striking example might have been Inconvenience Food, by the documentary by Al Gore about the environment. And I remember how that time was, okay, we're talking about global warming. And I don't know anything about this. I'm not a scientist. I go see the movie and I'm thinking, oh my God, we're gonna die in 10 years. And literally everything in the movie turned out to be false. And I hear that.
Yeah, misrepresented a lot. Yeah, definitely.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying that it didn't. I mean, I might deny it, but I'm just saying that it comes up as propaganda now.
Yes, you're right.
So they push you far in a way. But what also was interesting about that time was the social coercion. You have to agree with it, or you're a bad person.
Yeah. Yeah.
So where's the power coming from? So I think it's tactics is something that in our society, we need to believe that. We need to believe that Black lives. We should believe in the worst thing. We should believe in race, in politics. We don't believe in the better stuff.
Yeah. Got it. does seem sort of fear-based, this propaganda. So we actually have a question from one of our attendees here. When does intentional use of professional and severe propaganda, especially when it targets minors, transform into coercion? And there's a few different questions here related. Is the intent of propaganda actually to coerce? And do we as adults have to make overt efforts to not be coerced by modern day intense propaganda? So how are minors supposed to protect themselves when they're not as conscious or aware of the propaganda?
Okay.
Good question.
Yeah, very good question. Do you mind if I start, Eli?
Oh,
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So how are they supposed to? I guess they cannot. So in that sense, I think it's the role of the adults around them. So it's the role of the family, you know, and maybe, I mean that, okay, I'll just, I don't want to sort of go down a different route, but one thing that I really noticed here in the United States, and we had this conversation with Eli earlier, that because it's not an authoritarian political regime, I think people are much less aware of exactly of these things, right? So whatever happens in education, what you hear in school, well, that must be true, right? So whatever the teacher tells you, you follow what the teacher tells you, you believe what the teacher tells you. And that's, I mean, now it sort of has been changing over the past years for obvious reasons, and also because of social media and all that, like there's more awareness of that. But when I came here 20 something years ago, like that was something that really struck me, like people following authority without questioning whether that's going to be, you know, that's the right thing to do or not. Like for people who, you know, like Cuba or Hungary or any of those countries. So when you live in a system where you know that in the school the teachers have to teach certain things and it's not necessarily going to be a true reading of history, then with your conversations with your parents and all of that, you know. So you know that you question, you have the doubt. So I think to answer what they can do, I think what parents can do is really very important, right? And sometimes you do have to say to your child, no, what you hear in school is not actually correct, is not right, you know, to help them question, because that's just not really done in the United States. What was the first question? I can't remember that. Can you remind me, please?
When does intentional use of professional and severe propaganda, especially when it's targeting minors, when is it transformed into coercion? So is there a fine line between propaganda and coercion?
I mean, yes, of course. And this again, I think this whole thing is on a spectrum, right? So and it's going to be, again, it's a very subjective thing, you know, like somebody who might believe in a certain ideology and he says, I really want to raise awareness about this and this topic, and I want to raise awareness how we can solve this problem. Let's say the movie that Eli was mentioning, right? Like the Inconvenient Truth. What was that? Was that propaganda, or was that raising awareness to something that's real? So it is on a scale, and I don't think that you can sort of make just draw like a universal line and say, oh, from here it's going to be propaganda. It always depends on the context, which I know people don't really like to hear because it's unfortunate. And I got this question a lot in my class, right, at the university class from the students. But then how do we know what's true? And there is not one general sort of guide that you can give them. You know, it's you have to be smart, you have to be informed, you have to educate yourself from many different perspectives, and you have to make your own decision, right? When you think that you are being sort of propagandized, when it's too much, and what it's about. But if you will allow me for 1 minute, because I realized that there was, you asked like for specific examples of propaganda in education. And one that I know from my studies, right, and which also it just reminded me what Eli said, reminded me of that, you know, about the Jews and how the propaganda then during the Second World War, or, you know, in the 1930s happened in Europe. So there are two sort of statements that are actively being taught, or at least when, you know, I was still in Africa and studied, it still was being taught. One is that Black people cannot be racist. This is sort of like an axiom, right? They say Black people cannot be racist, and the other one is like all white people are racists. which by today sort of, for people who are more aware, they sort of sound like slogans, right? Like, which they are. But these are things that are effectively taught or actually taught in university classes. And whenever somebody wants, or the other thing that was, and I mentioned that in my class, I remember the students were, pretty surprised. The other, it's sort of like a truism that you have to accept as truth. And then it's sort of, because it's part of the education system, it becomes the truth, right? The other thing is like to say that, what was that? That okay, so Black people's history, Black history is human history. Like to say that and to claim that Black people's suffering, North American Black suffering is not somehow unique and incomparable to anything different, that is somehow demeaning. That's a racist statement to say. And this is part of what is being taught in many, humanities classes in the universities. And that I feel is really direct propaganda. And one of the outcomes of that, and that was, I think it was before George Floyd, right? I started seeing it wasn't Substack yet, it was another platform, like actively articles coming, being sent to me, which was all about all white people are racists. So that means you and you and you, and hey, honey, you specifically also, like sort of in very demeaning language. And then you had like these photos that they take from whatever Unsplash or just the internet, which is like a family of clearly, like light-skinned people. And that was exactly what Nazi propaganda looked like. They take a picture of a certain type of people that they think is going to be the evil, that they think is going to be the enemy. And then they start going off and saying, oh, because we were taught in the school that, these people are, I don't know, taking our money, sucking our blood, just to be really blunt. That's exactly what was going on. So to say, oh, all white people are racist, there will be a lot of people who take this literally and then start going off on that. And that really is the first step to dehumanizing somebody else. And in this context, it's going to be that. But in a different context, it was the Jews. In another context, it was the Tutsis, right? In the Rwandan context. But the structure is the same. The process is the same.
Okay.
I hope it answers the
Yeah.
question.
So I think that's really very, very well said. The one thing that I noticed, I was doing a documentary, Killing America, and it was looking at the school boards. And what was fascinating were the T-shirts that showed up that were in support of ethnic studies, the oppressed model. What they hashtag the system, these like believe T-shirt, don't question my authority, so forth. And so I go, okay, of course you want to respect the T-shirt. You want to, give the T-shirt that the respect to T-shirt kid. So I'm sitting there looking at that, and then by chance I'm walking my dog. And this woman comes up to me and she's a T-shirt. She is from Ethiopia, adopted by two parents who are professors at UCLA. And for some reason, we started talking politics. And she said, no, the T-shirt is accountable to the parent. You must ask the teacher question. You must always talk to the teacher and find out what's going on. And if the teacher stonewalls you, you need to pull your kid out of the classroom. And this was a teacher in the public schools in LA. So I thought it was fascinating to hear two very different perspectives. So I think the big question though really is, the big issue here really is with somebody claimed authority, that much authority, and put that authority in your face. Beep, that should set up an alarm. And that's why I teach my kids one day. From this issue, I think the best question from this issue was question everything, especially when you're a kid.
Yeah.
Ask them to explain why this is the way it is. If you pretend to see you as a bad, ask them why this is, so forth. Always ask why. Why? Oh, so Black people can't be racist? Why?
Mm.
And that's forces the teacher to answer that question. You should not accept things that's bad, unless they're obvious, unless they're indisputable bad. But when you put our thought as a fact or some sort of theory as a fact, then that's a problem. So I think the key really, and as you said, Ildi, is just talk to the kid. Have dinner with them, talk to them on the way home from school. I have a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old, and we're going through the same thing that most parents go through. And all they do is just talk to them and talk to them and give them that independent, to ask questions and so forth. So.
I think it's really good advice. Speaking of someone who has a 15-year-old, you can't talk to your kids too much, especially now. We got another question from the audience that I thought was really good. It's a bit of a brain teaser, but bear with me. The question is, could the Overton window serve as an equivalent to the paradigm? And by that, in that both propaganda and the Overton window can both be understood to refer to the field of allowable thought. But before you jump in, my thought is that the Overton window reflects allowable thought, but it seems to relate more to organic thought, or maybe it doesn't, rather than thought dictated from the government or other source of power. I guess when I think of propaganda around DEI, for example, it was really intense and coercive for years. You couldn't argue against it. You couldn't challenge it. It was just anathema. But there seems to come a point in a free society, not Cuba maybe, but in American society, for example, where organic thought sort of coalesces around a majority sensibility, and people are like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. And that gives them the power to resist propaganda. And I think that might be what we're seeing now, is that the Overton window is shifting and is empowering those who challenge the allowable field of thought that's coming from propaganda. Does that make sense? I just wanted to get your thoughts on how the Overton window relates. But that's my thought. But
I think it completely makes sense, and I would agree with that, because a paradigm is always something, it's not necessarily forced by the government, but it's basically it's the basic thinking patterns of a culture, right? Which of course is shaped by the government, or it's shaped by religion, like whatever is something that's really strong in a given society, right?
Mhm.
So, or it's shaped by academia, right? Again, like depending on which society we're talking about, I think today in North America, it's going to mostly be shaped by academia, right? So,
Mhm.
humanities research and all of that, culture, sort of, again, like historical wrongs, and then how do we atone for them? Do we have to atone for them? So all of that, that's the paradigm. So I would agree with what you said about the connection between the two. And also, like what you're saying, that in a democratic society, in a really open, and that's the sign of an open society, that there is a chance for resistance to build, and not just build and then be quiet, right? Like it would be in Cuba, or it used to be in Eastern Europe, but that resistance to actually show up and then start becoming part of mainstream conversations. Because that's the only way we can change that. Like, how are you going to change education? How are you going to change the way artists are supposed to present themselves, or the kind of topics that they're supposed to tackle? Only by that. It's organic change. It's sort of, if you want to go like grassroots change, I think that's the best way.
That's wonderful.
But the question is, what makes the window? What creates the window? I mean, that's a big question. What force you create the Overton window? So that's what you need to look at. So we have political correctness. We have all these forces. You should stay there, but you can't stay there. Even colleges have reporting systems. If you go too far, we'll report you, and you'll be kicked out of college. I didn't grow up with that. I grew up with, I think I went to Claremont Mechanical College, so the classical liberal arts college where you should stay anything, and the people these days, some racist stuff. But the point was, do you argue against that? So I think that's a great question, because if there is the Overton window, then I think the question then become what created that window? And
Mhm.
who's the power behind that? And so that's sort of, it's like the old Wizard of Oz. I mean, it's the same old story. And I think I'm in a unique position because I come from a multiracial background. So I can ask questions and not get in trouble, and I think that's sort of why I've always been on the outside. And so that's why I go, no, that's not true, that all Black people can be racist. That's not true. I can, my point is that I never had to go along with that. So I think that's the big thing that was in the last week has been sort of shocking to see some of people's behavior. And I think the ocean window that was holding for a long time is now frustrated. It has not become weak. And I think the left has been the one that has been trying to enforce it and hold on to the windows they created. The right is in danger of creating new windows, and that's something that we have to guard against. But it's interesting to see the left trying to hold on to the window where the limits are, and it's not working. The people are just kind of going right through it. The shame is why did it take so long?
Thank you very much. That makes a lot of sense too. It's an interesting question. I really think the whoever asked it, I really thank you. That's very thought-provoking. Let's see what else. A couple of other. It's just I had some questions, but I think it's more important to get the audience questions in. So yesterday on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the Academy of American Poets posted a poem about Gaza that was written by a Palestinian poet. What is the best way to explain to a person or organization why such a move is inappropriate when it could easily post the poem on another day that wasn't dedicated, obviously, to the International Holocaust Remembrance? Eli, maybe you want to take that. It might be.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is this trying to propose them. I mean, I don't know if it's fault in the propaganda in a way, but I mean, blindly, I mean, to somebody on the street, this would be an FU. Basically, they're saying FU to the Holocaust. I mean, that's what we're saying. I mean, that's on the bottom. That's what this is about. And so, these people believe in what they believe in. And yeah, sure, I don't know. I mean, the best way to explain to the organization, maybe I'm a little bit pessimistic, but even organization is going to do that. They're gone. They're long gone. I mean, they're long gone. And yeah, I mean, they're long gone. They believe in that. I don't really have a better answer than that because yeah, I mean, they're gone. So I don't know, I mean, how are you convince them?
Yeah.
Yeah, how are you going to convince them? I don't think you can. I mean, they really did F you. And so the reason why I did I have been in a situation before where somebody has done something similar to that. And I've tried to reason with them and I've tried to do, stuff. But the problem is I'm not reasoning with them on lawsuit only. I'm also talking about this job, the income. You're wrong. You're morally wrong. They don't believe that they believe in the ideology which gives them morality. So that's the danger with propaganda, is the propaganda can give you a false sense of morality. So maybe this is propaganda in a sense, but they are getting the morality in some way. And you're trying to go up against an institution that has made that morality a power structure. Let me give you an example of the association now. By making this statement, by putting out a poem on Gaza on Holocaust Remembrance Day, they are telling their own members, fall in line, go along with what we say, or you are out. So that's a massive form of coercion, because now you sit there and go, I object. Okay, good, you're free to go. I don't even know this now. That's what they say now. This looks like a good fit for you. It's time for you to go. Then you get angry. This is how you go. So that's it. I mean, that's it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about our organization to do what the power structure is, but that statement, but that act is definitely a power move to close rank around a certain viewpoint.
And if I could just jump in for 1 second, I think how it relates or connects to propaganda in education is Because again, whether what the poet was saying or not is propaganda or not, that again depends on perspective, right? But that the person who put that up there, who posted it there, that he or she doesn't realize that this is so disrespectful and that this is somehow an encouraged way or sort of a moral way of acting, that really comes from this educational system, which tells people, you know, your activist ideas should be out there without respect to other people's, you know, sensibilities, and because you're right. That person thinks that you're right. So that person doesn't have context. He or she doesn't have a full context, because if she had or he had the full context, he wouldn't be that disrespectful. And if he hadn't been encouraged, you know, like
Yeah,
by the education system to be activists like that, they would know the difference.
the poem was called Gaza Has Become a Funeral Home.
Oh,
That's the name of the poem. Yeah.
What was the title?
Gaza has become a funeral home.
oh, wow.
So, yeah.
Okay, as we wrap up, Ildi, I thought we might want to touch on the work you've done with the Shelby Steele Foundation and how it explores themes of propaganda. And Eli, actually, maybe you can just give us just a little teaser by telling us why your foundation funded Ildi's new project, Captured Landscapes, and then Ildi, you can tell us more about the project.
Yeah, I think the reason why we supported this was because we recognize the power of propaganda, especially in the last 15 years, how it's been such an incredible force in shaping our society. I mean, if you just think about how the propaganda grew from our, Trayvon Martin's death, Michael Brown, all the way up to George Floyd. And so we thought that Ildi's work of, going back, like into Cuba, to Hungary, would give a wider perspective to what's going on in America. Sometimes the best way to understand what's going on in your country is to look outward first, to see how it works in other countries, and then find the similarities to your own countries. So we were, very happy to support her important work.
Thank you, Eli. Ildi, you want to tell us more about the project?
Okay, I see that time is very short, so I'm just going to be very
We
brief.
may run over a little. We really want to hear about your project. So
Okay,
take the
okay.
time, take the time you need, I'm sure.
Okay, so the title is Captured Landscapes, as you mentioned, and the idea behind that is that, like captured landscapes is sort of how propaganda or slogans or scripted communication, a lot of that captures our physical and mental landscapes, right? And physical landscapes, I mean, for example, in New York City, the billboards, like the flashing lights, the all of that, the commercial advertising, and mental landscapes, of course, like how all of this affects, the way people think. So this is going to be a multimedia project. It's going to be art and documentary, and it's going to combine documentary photography, my documentary photography, and music, jazz music. My collaborator for the project is Elio Villafranca. He's a Cuban-born and Cuban-raised, classically trained but jazz musician who lives in New York, and we're collaborating with that. And so what I would like to sort of circle around or explore, to use like a fashionable word, with the project, that's really how commercial propaganda and how political propaganda have similar building blocks, how they function, how life or thinking of people is influenced in a culture of slogans, and how that compares in New York, which is going to be the commercial propaganda, and in Cuba, which is more direct and political propaganda. So that's sort of like a very, very short description of the project.
Thank you so much for giving that. And I guess that really does bring us to the end of our webinar. You were much more succinct than I thought you'd be, Ildi. There's so much to talk about, but you squeezed it in.
Well, because if I start talking about this now, like it's gonna be another 10 minutes. I do have it prepared, and I thought, but maybe I'll talk about it at a different point.
Okay.
But that's sort of the short version.
The short version. Well, and for people who want the longer version, they can visit Ildi's work at on her website, www.ildikotillmann.com. I'm going to spell it out, ILDIKOTILLMANN. And maybe I will just drop this also in the chat for everyone. And you can follow Eli and his work on Substack and X at Man of Steel. So that brings us to the end of our evening, and I just want to thank you, all of you, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. It's very timely, and I hope you learned a lot. And lastly, I also want to remind everyone, as I always do, that FAIR exists entirely on goodwill. We're able to operate solely based on donations from curious and interested people like all of you attending tonight. We do our very best to offer programming and educational information that helps bring awareness, attention, and solutions to what we at FAIR feel are the most timely and relevant issues facing us. So with that said, we hope you'll consider donating to FAIR and joining our pro-human movement to help us keep doing the work you all value. The links are in the chat, or you can visit us at fairforall.org to make your contribution. And with that, I thank you all, and we will see you at the next webinar. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for having us.